So did you guys notice that around the world there are many countries that are protesting their governments and everything, and they are basically raising in some of those countries the One Piece flag, basically as a revolution sign and something like that. So throughout this video, let's talk about all of what's going on, and we're gonna dive deep into the meaning of the Straw Hat flag and this whole protest and everything. And so in the countries that are rising up against their own governments and raising the One Piece flag at the same time, we've got Nepal, Serbia, Indonesia, Togo, Philippines, France, Italy, Switzerland, San Marino, Maldives, Peru, Morocco, Paraguay, and Cameroon. And basically in all of those countries, they all have the same slogan, the same energy, the same flag at the same time. So you can say that yes, they are using pretty much the One Piece flag as a sign of revolution. And look at this article right here. It says Gen Z protesters around the world lead wave of generational discontent. From the Andes to the Himalayas, a new wave of protest is unfolding across the world, driven by generational discontent against governments and anger amongst young people. This week, Madagascar's president, Andre, was forced out of power and out of the country after a military mutiny. The culmination of weeks of demonstrations led by young protesters referring to themselves as Gen Z Madagascar. The rage against the political establishment in the Indian Ocean island country mirrors other recent protests across the world. In countries like the Nepal, the Philippines, Indonesia, Kenya, Peru, and Morocco, these protests have been sparked by specific grievances, but are driven by long simmering issues like widening inequality, economic uncertainty, corruption, and nepotism of leaders. But they have one thing in common. Mostly leaderless, they are made up primarily of young people who brand themselves as Gen Z, defined as those born roughly between 1996 and 2010, the first generation to grow up entirely in the internet age. What connects these young-led protests is a shared sense that traditional political systems aren't responsive to their generational concerns. Whether that's corruption, climate change, or economic inequality, protest then becomes the logical outlet when institutional channels feel blocked. Though their specific demands differ, most of these protests have been sparked by government outreach or neglect. Some have also confronted harsh treatment by security forces and brutal repression. In Morocco, for example, a leaderless collective called Gen Z 212, named after Morocco's dial-in code, has taken to the streets to demand better public services and increased spending on health and education. In Peru, protests over a pension law exploded into broader demands, including action to tackle rising insecurity and widespread corruption in the government. In Indonesia, deadly protests have erupted over lawmakers' perks and the cost of living, forcing the president to replace key economic and security ministers. And the most widely recognized movement to be dubbed as Gen Z protest was a deadly uprising in Nepal that culminated with the resignation of the prime minister in September. Protesters drew inspiration from successful anti-government movements elsewhere in South Asia, for example in Sri Lanka in 2022 and Bangladesh in 2024. So basically you see that in all of those countries, people had enough of their crooked and corrupt, very corrupt politicians, and so Gen Z decided to take actions. Now, what is the connection to the Straw Hat flag and the One Piece anime flag and all of that? Well, let's see. In here it says, across multiple countries, a singular pop culture symbol has emerged, a grinning skull and crossbone wearing a straw hat. The flag comes from a cult Japanese manga and anime series called One Piece, which follows a crew of pirates as they take on corrupt governments. In Nepal, protests hung the same flag on the gates of the Singha Dorbar, the seat of the Nepalese government, and on ministries, many of which were torched in protests. It was also hoisted by crowds in Indonesia, the Philippines, Morocco, and Madagascar. Last week in the Peruvian capital, Lima, 27-year-old electrician David Tafour stood with the same flag in St. Martin's Square, now the stage for weekly protests. And they are all saying we're fighting the same battle against corrupt officials who in our case are also killers. And basically they are just looking into that flag as a symbol of liberation, basically, because that is what in the One Piece it represents in a way. So from my point of view, if everybody is looking for a revolution, yes, it's a good idea to use that flag, but at the same time they are also tarnishing the idea of what the One Piece is and tarnishing what the flag of the One Piece is and what it's really supposed to mean, you know. Because at the same time I believe if they really wanted to get a flag that's really into the revolution, they would have probably went for Dragon's flag, but no one knows about his flag yet. So that's why the closest thing enough was the Straw Hat flag. That was basically the closest thing to the One Piece whole idea and everything in a way. And it's not just about the flag, but it's literally about the Straw Hats, Luffy and his crew members and all of that, and how they are protecting themselves against all of the corruption and the illegal stuff that some politicians might be doing around the world and all of that. And why does the One Piece actually resonate so much with the Gen Z? I will tell you. Basically, they grew up literally inside their homes watching stuff. And basically One Piece, one of the stuff that they were watching as an anime, you know, like if people wanted to watch some animes, One Piece is basically one of the best out of them all, you know. But the idea is, why are they representing the idea of revolution with the One Piece flag, basically the Straw Hat flag from One Piece? And why not from another anime, from for example Hunter x Hunter or whatever? But literally through all of the animes and mangas that exist out there, there is no such anime that even come close to the ideas that are represented in One Piece, and how reality based it is a little bit in that world and all of that literally brings specifically the Gen Z to think of some of those events in that anime as, oh yeah, maybe we can probably do the same. And so that's their thinking, you know. They see inequality, they have a solution, they know how to do the solution by protesting and all of that. Some of them are light, meaning they don't go as crazy as in other countries, but in other countries, those protests turn very deadly and crazy. But that's where I have a problem, because when stuff start to turn deadly, now we are talking about real life deadly stuff and all of that, which is not what we're supposed to be doing to each other, you know. So don't forget that through all of this and through all of this anime, One Piece and all of that, protests and all of that, guys, be safe. Everybody be safe. Don't be living in a fantasy world and trying to replicate those same ideas from a fantasy world into the real world, because it never works the same way and it's always going to be for the worst. So I'm telling you. On that note, guys, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and your boy is going to see you in the next one. Peace.